Good morning, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here for so many reasons, and really want to thank Robin and Lakshmi and Liz for inviting me and bringing us all together. I really actually want to thank so many of you, all of you in this room, for doing the work that you do. In my book, there are 70 pages of citations that my publisher wanted to put offline because it made the book seem too academic, and I'm not an academic. And I put a stake in the ground and said, no, 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 those have to really stay in the book. So the 30 pages of bibliography are online. But I cite a lot of the work that you do, and I'm eternally grateful that you are doing it. Just by way of a little bit of background, I was a feminist writer and activist in college in the 80s, and then I went into the workforce thinking I'll take my feminist self and do feminist things, and the world will get more and more feminist, and that didn't happen. And I worked in journalism and media as a writer and an editor, and then on the business side in market development, strategy. That then turned into data and technology. So I did that for 15 years. And then in about 2010, I decided to chuck it all and start writing about social justice and inequality and the role of women in the world. And the most interesting thing about that was that there was such a violent and vitriolic response. I could be writing about the color of children's clothes or rape and war, and the result was virulent. It was rape threats, death threats, graphic pornography. And I started talking to other women who were doing this work, and they were experiencing very similar things. And one night we were a group of us all together, and we were making jokes about the rape threats that we get. And I didn't want to make jokes about the rape threats that we were getting. And when we started talking about it, they didn't want to either. And so that began a whole, what is now 7-year campaign to address freedom of expression and the nexus of technology, freedom of expression, and violence, gender-based violence, racial violence in particular. So the work that I do now is writing, but I also run a project for the Women's Media Center that's called the Speech Project that focuses on all of those issues. And we work on policy issues, we lobby tech companies, we have escalation channels when necessary to help people who find themselves the focus of these kinds of online attacks. So I actually had this book proposal that I thought of in my head as a book called Equal Enough, because I kept hearing that I was equal enough and that I should shut up. And I kind of had it in the back of my head for a long time, and then we had our election. And anger was palpable. It was so clear. It was clear everywhere. But I thought there were two distinct angers. One was this anger of resentment and aggrieved entitlement, the disgust and contempt and fear that we associate often with anger, and that we socialize, we're learned to think of anger in those terms. But I also saw this immense anger of hope and compassion and joy and quest for social justice. And we never talk about that. And the communities that I belong to, that were vibrant, joyful, creative communities, came together in anger. And it wasn't a cruel anger, it was an empathetic anger. So I wanted to think about what that meant, particularly as it pertains to those of us who try and speak up. There were too many people that I knew who were silencing themselves out of fear. They stopped writing about certain topics. They stopped speaking in certain places. And no one really seemed to take that as a degradation of democratic norms or ideals, because frankly, it was happening mainly to women, often to women of color. And the traditional approach to that is that we're supposed to keep ourselves safe. But what was really happening is that those traditional vulnerabilities that women have infused our institutions. So when we talk about fake news, or misinformation, that's a macrocosm of reputation damaging, revenge porn, violent threats online, but we have this public-private divide. And so I recast the book with this filter of anger as a Trojan horse to look at all of these issues through a topic that everybody understands, because everybody feels anger. But it's very clear that we are not allowed to express anger virtually in any way acceptably, particularly as women. So we know all the stereotypes. They're belittling stereotypes. So you start off as a spoiled princess. How many people have seen videos of little girls having temper tantrums because they're so cute, right? And then you go to being a hormonal teen, to being an angry black woman, to being a nag. I had to laugh this morning because I was thinking, well, you know, people have different practice rituals and routines. If you're an athlete, you practice your sport, and if you're a pianist, you practice your piano. And I laughed because I thought, well, what I do before a speech is I watch morning TV. And there was an ad for California Closets, and it was actually, I was surprised. It was a Southeast Asian family, and they were young, and they had 4 or 5 kids, and they had these amazing closets. And the husband and wife sat at the end, and it was going really well. And then he looks at his wife, and he says, "I finally did something right." And she smiled, and she said, you often do things right." And when he said, "I finally did something right," in my brain I heard, "You're usually just such a bitch." Because the subtext was, she's a nag, I'm bad at things at home, and she gets angry at me, and now she's smiling. And who doesn't like a smiling woman, right? This is like getting ready in my brain. So I think that this anger, this emotion does reside at the nexus of all of these critical and important issues that we think about and deal with. And it's not just a matter of how we feel, it's a matter of our experiences and whether they have any social traction. So I think a lot, I mean, there's several books that have been written. Brittany Cooper wrote Eloquent Rage, Rebecca Traister wrote Good and Mad. We all know each other, but we did not write together. We were writing 3 people in 3 different spaces about remarkably similar things, but in different ways. But we all quoted Audre Lorde. And Audre Lorde was very influential in all of our thinking, and she said, anger it's knowledge. And I really take that to heart, because what we're talking about in the expression of anger is epistemology. And I think that's centrally important to the kind of work that you do and the kind of work that I do. The story I tell in my book that relates to this question of epistemic justice is about my great-grandmother. And she was 14, and she was living in what was then called Transjordan. It was a French protectorate. It wasn't even Jordan. And the family fairy tale that I was told when I was 5 was that she was a beautiful young girl walking down the street one day, and a handsome man on a horse rode in, picked her up, swept her off her feet, rode into the desert, and here we are, our family on this side of the world. And the next time I heard it, I was 11, and it didn't sound that great. It didn't sound like a fairy tale, because I'd already been threatened with rape, harassed every day, had an acute sense of double standards, boy-girl double standards in my own family and school. And so that time, I said to my family, it sounds like she was kidnapped and serially raped. And the guy who did it should go to jail. And that was my great-grandfather. And so 2 things happened in that moment. No one responded, which was my first official feminist pat on the head. And there were 2 aspects of epistemic injustice that I see in that story. One is that my testimony was questioned, and I didn't have power or credibility for people to consider what I was saying. Because what I was saying was, I'm harassed, My mother, her sisters, every woman I see is being harassed on the street. And I'm scared. I have had this rape threat. What is going on here? No one's talking about it. But there was no uptake to that testimony. The second part, though, was that by ignoring what happened to my great-grandmother, who ended up catatonic, by the way, she had no ability to function in the world as a 56, 57-year-old woman, but there was no social value to her experience, and there was no language. There was a hermeneutic void around her experience and the experiences of many women like her, and women who experience sexual violence, incest, domestic violence. It had no social worth in our family. And it still has poor social worth in our societies. And so my question was, why don't we have the right to be angry about that and have that anger respected and become part of our social lives and our political lives? I think that what was also interesting about this idea that anger is knowledge, anger is information, is that a lot of people think in corollary to that about what Audre Lorde said about self-care, that it's a politically revolutionary act. And there's a deep connection in that to another idea, which is self-governance. There's a thread in Greek political history and in our own founding fathers' history of the notion of self-care and how we define self-governance as actually a weapon against people. Certain people are not supposed to be capable of self-governance. Black people, women. So we have a paternalistic approach. When she claimed that self-care was politically revolutionary, that's what I think of. I think about this idea that we are perfectly capable of caring for ourselves. And this is where anger becomes such a challenge, because we have these sort of aging stereotypes, but we then also have all of the ethnic stereotypes for women. And these stereotypes include, angry Black girls and women, sad Asian girls. That's a play on the anger stereotype because, in fact, we divide those emotions up. Anger is masculine and sadness is feminine. If you're a white woman, you're crazy, right? And if you're Hispanic, maybe you're hot. And maybe you're compared to a consumable food substance. All of those are belittling, but they're also infantilizing. And that act of infantilizing us in our anger is paternalistic. It is denying us the right to self-governance. And so I was really, really taken with these ideas of courage and conviction. Because as a writer, language is super important. And I would argue that the work you do is even more important from that perspective because I look to your work to fuel my work. I explicitly set out in 2010 to take the amazing academic work that I've been reading for decades and try and make it more popularly consumable. Give it narrative framing, give it political resonance in the moment. So if you look at a lot of my articles, there's more red hyperlink than actually no red hyperlink. And that was just my way of trying to literally write an 800-word article that had 50 links in it so that people could go find this work that they might not come across otherwise. But the words courage and conviction are also gendered. Most people, when they think of the word bravery, think of men and masculinity, and they think of protection. And the idea of protection doesn't extend to women, for example, as mothers. They're protecting us all day. They're protecting us from food toxicity, from environmental toxicity. In my house, I'm the techie person, from predatory online harassers, whatever, but we don't call it protection. And so even these two words, courage and conviction, can be problematic, and I'm so happy because I know you know that. I don't need to cite your research to explain that. But the thing is that in anger, and this begins for girls when they're young, there is this quality of self-defense. And in fact, we're all socialized to put the needs of others first, to be communal in our orientation, to subsume our own needs, and to use our nice voices, to smile more, to be considerate, to not interrupt as much, and in fact, in the end, to act in ways that are subservient or subaltern or submissive. And in doing that, indignity becomes imminent in our femininity. And so in the past 7 months since my book was launched, I would say that the most common response I get is, I didn't even know I was angry, because we become so detached from even understanding the emotion in ourselves. We learn to calibrate ourselves so carefully to the environments we're in and to the people we're with, so that we are pleasing and nice and make people comfortable. And it takes a lot of time to come to. And when we do, it's often the case that people get angry back. And they don't get angry back because of what we're saying. They get angry back because we're angry. In intimate relationships and interpersonal relationships, particularly if they're heterosexual, women who get angry are perceived as selfish, as difficult, as self-centered, no matter how legitimate their grievance is. And so when you scale that up into institutions, as we know, that turns into a more explicit display of power. It's hard, I think, for people to talk about power in their interpersonal relationships, a little easier in the workplace. But we know that power accrues to men as leaders when they display anger, and that, in fact, women are penalized for displaying the same. And so when I did write the book, it was a direct response to the treatment of political candidates. That idea that anger might be a good way to do this really struck me during the debates, and in the fact that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump could leverage public populist rage. They could physically leverage it. They could stand at a podium and thump it and look unhinged with their hair and their hands and their pallor, you know? And there was Hillary Clinton, literally bound in her flak jacket under her jacket and on the stage, and didn't have the physical freedom, her hair, everything about her. And actually that idea of taking up space with movement is also related to anger and childhood socialization. We have all of these norms with little children. Boys can go twice as far away from their parents when they're learning to toddle. They learn to be physically expansive. And the interesting thing to me, one of the more interesting bits of research that I found in doing this, was the relationship between your physical appearance and mien and the production of testosterone. Because one of the responses I always get when I talk about how women should or can or do express themselves, whether there's aggression or anger or just assertiveness, is, well, of course boys and men are more of all of those things because they have so much testosterone. When in fact, the behavior and the testosterone have a mutually productive relationship. They are not one, it's not unidirectional. This combination of things, as a writer, and I believe as an academic, becomes really complicated around the notion of subjectivity. Anger is subjective in that it centers the self. I need this to happen. I feel this is wrong. I have a problem. And in stating this, as calmly or as irrationally as I might, I'm saying that you have to pay attention to what I'm saying, and that indeed I'm going to hold you accountable as a person, as an institution, as a political system. And women are not supposed to hold people accountable. They're not supposed to demand accountability. And if you remember the Larry Nasser trial, it was one of the first times in my memory that I can think of a judge allowing women in the hundreds to jointly make statements. Usually rape victims are isolated. They're not allowed to testify in unison or in the same procedure. And this judge allowed them unlimited time to do this. And then she made a closing statement that was really no different from the closing statements that any judge might make. And liberal media men criticized her for being subjective and not objective, and for inserting her own perspective, which in fact is what judging implies, right? But there's a conflict in some people's minds because of the linguistics between woman and judging. And we have the same conflict with woman and anger. And the duskier the lady, the bigger the conflict, right? Because it can't possibly be reasonable that she has this demands to make. So in media, it's often the case that those of us who do this work or have this perspective or do these research, do this kind of research, are considered inherently not objective. And that then means we enter the stupid realm of false equivalences. So if you have a really knowledgeable scholar, whether it's in the issue of gender and race, or climate change, or creationism, and intelligent design, they're then pitted in media with someone who knows nothing, has not done the work, has not done the research, and is given equal legitimacy because of this kind of understanding or lack of understanding of some of the issues that we're talking about. And so it's difficult to be in the position of having your courage and convictions be so unwelcome, because they are material challenges to the status quo, to power, and I would argue ultimately to people's personal sense of status and identity. In the work that I do, which is increasingly focused on the more and more granular, younger and younger, because I'm being winnowed down to giving up on adults. It's clear that the performance of certain types of masculinity trumps the safety and well-being and rights of children and women. And, this isn't to say that anger is equally available as a political tool to all men, because it's very clearly not. President Obama could not display anger because he was a black man. So we have all these stereotypes about women, but we know that in this country, black male anger is associated with criminality. Now that's a different kind of power because it's a threatening power, but it's not the power that many white men have, which is that their anger is by default considered a civic virtue, and that it has political resonance, and it harkens back to a long tradition. All of these issues, to me, were accessible through stories about anger, my stories and other people's stories, and stories about what happens when we express our convictions, and what the pushback is, and what we do about that pushback, and how we manage that. I'm not a therapist, but at the end of the book, I have sort of 10 broad outlines of how to rethink anger so that it can become a useful tool. I was particularly concerned for immediately the people I know doing this work, because they're all exhausted. They're tired and they're exhausted, and a lot of the exhaustion comes from stress, but a lot of the stress comes from not being able to even say, I'm angry. So the name Rage Becomes Her is a play on several things, one of it being that without the acknowledgement of this emotion, which many people struggle with this, particularly girls and women, without acknowledgement, it becomes material in the body. It contributes to a whole array of illnesses, physical and mental. And one of my objectives was to say, we have to stop making ourselves sick. We have these convictions, we are courageous, but it shouldn't consume us in this way. And if you have a framework and a language for understanding, if you have the research that explains what this looks like, then you can be more creative, productive, healthy, joyful, compassionate, and have more political efficacy. I'm not really big on personal narratives of change and victory, and I think that's important. But for me, anger and self-care are manifested in political action and in the work that you choose to do. And because the issues are so granular, the solutions have to be granular too. And they have to be available to everyone, because these problems can seem so big and overwhelming that people detach. They don't want to do the work, they don't know how to do the work, and they throw up their hands in despair. But in fact, there is a lot that people can do in the small, everyday interactions of life, which was what I was hoping to be able to convey with the book. So I do want to close so we have time for questions. I want to say thank you all again so much. Your work is very much appreciated in my part of the world.